Welcome to Environmental Law course. Dear learner and viewer, we are going to continue our lecture on environmental policy in historical perspective in India. In the last lecture, you can vividly recall that we have discussed environmental policy in historical perspective from the standpoint of the forest, forestry, and the water resources. And we have seen that how the colonial laws and policy in the modern Indian historical annals have created a kind of a perspective which stifled people's customary rights, their entitlement, and ultimately all the environmental laws and policy in colonial India turned into a kind of a monopolization, a kind of the state control, a kind of the alienation of the people, a kind of stifling environmental justice, a kind of marginalizing the peasantry rights, the grazing rights of the common man. Now, we have also seen that how these colonial policies and laws in relation to environment in modern Indian history, which is said to be a colonial character of the law, have tried to see environment and natural resources simply a part of the economy and the economic development to fulfill the needs and aspiration of capitalism and imperialism vis-a-vis the colonialism, and simply draining out the wealth, extracting Indian resources to fulfill the needs and aspirations of the post industrial revolution England. Now we will further examine, apart from the previous lecture, in relation to the land rights, in relation to the forest rights, in relation to the customary rights, in relation to the land rights, in relation to the canal and irrigation rights, in relation to the rights which are deeply embedded into the water resources, water sharing, control and management and nurturing of the water courses and rivers. Now we will switch over to the industrial part of it, taking studies and examples of minerals, mines, petroleum resources, oil fields, natural gas, fisheries, traditional and customary rights towards the natural and the mineral resources. In this lecture, dear learner and viewer, we'll be devoting to how the Britishers in colonial India seen and perceive the Indian soil not only fertile for forest and forest resources and timber and a sustained timber supply to meet the demands of the World War I and World War II, and construction of the coaches for the railways and construction of the ship and the ship needs of the shipbuilding industry in Europe. But it also paid adequate attention to mines and minerals, especially in the state of Bihar, in the state of Jharkhand, in the state of Bengal, in the state of Odisha, in the state of Madhya Pradesh, in central and eastern India as a whole. The rich depositories of mines and minerals has been realized, and therefore the Britishers devoted its attention for coal mining right from 1800 without having any kind of a regulation. This expanded the coal mining as a policy of colonialism. Then they promulgated Mines Act in 1901, and the same Mines Act was also amended in 1923 to create a labor force, including women, children, and adults, for extraction and regulation of the mines, especially the coal mining. It is also devoted to the mica, bauxite, and uranium mining in the eastern part of India, and created a kind of an exploitative system. And to have a massive mining, they have created laws for the land acquisition, and it has displaced many from their land by the land acquisition laws. We'll be discussing in this lecture that how the Britishers' pursuit of extractions of minerals and mines resulted into alienation of the people from the land and displacement. It has also created a kind of a attention towards extraction of the petroleum resources, and the Petroleum Act 1934 and Oilfield Act 1948 are the living illustrations and example whereby the Britishers have centralized controlled under their colonial sets of bureaucracy and state monopolization and power, and then they try to create a kind of a nationalization system of the petroleum and the oil fields. In this lecture, we'll be also discussing about how the natural gas, fossil fuel have also been like ethane, propane, and butane, and the underground reservoirs which is associated with the oil deposits are being used and extracted by the Britishers in the colonial India. The environmental policy in historical perspective in India also happens to devote on massive fishing, and so much so that the Indian Fisheries Act 1897 and Bengal Private Fisheries Act 1889 introduced a state and zamindari control over the fishing rights of the community. And these two laws have put the fishing community and the fisher folks into margin as their traditional fishing rights declined. Most of the fishing rights acquired by the leasing rights, license rights. Most of the fishing activities are being regulated by the water resources and water irrigation laws, where the state has a control and commercial exploitation of the water courses and irrigation system by putting cess and its distribution. Then what we see in this lecture, taking example, as we have taken example of the forestry, land, and water. In the present lecture on the environmental policy and historical perspective, we'll be taking three areas like mines and minerals, petroleum, and fishing to reflect upon the colonial policy. Dear learner and viewer, let us begin with the mining and the resource extraction. As had been said, that the coal mining began in Raniganj in 1840 and expanded in Jharia in 1880. Raniganj presently being in West Bengal and Jharia is presently being in Jharkhand. It has more than 200 years of history of mining now. The Britishers started coal mining. Michael Anderson has written on the colonial character of the environmental law and has studied the Bengal Smoke Nuisance Act in the context of, because when the presidency town is being established at Calcutta, where the East India Company was established, so the distance from Raniganj to Kolkata was very close. So the Britisher invoked this act to control the smoke nuisance and the use of coal in chimneys in Calcutta by appointing inspectors to regulate that the air pollution arising out of use of coal taken from Raniganj reached to Kolkata, and then it started furnace and the chimneys creating air pollution. So the gentry which were in the presidency town, in order to have better air quality, promulgated Bengal Smoke Nuisance Act in the backdrop of the coal mining in Raniganj and Jharia in 1880s. Then Bengal British investors were very much interested into the coal mining extraction through the Bengal coal companies. At the same time, to see that the coal mining and the coal is being transported all the nook and corners of India, then the Britisher introduced railways and the demands of the coal which were felt across India. And that's why when we see all these places, especially Raniganj and Jharia, it was having a very good railway connectivity right from the colonial days, so that the coal can easily be transported to the demanding locations in different nook and corner of the world, nook and corner of India. Then it also created a kind of a feudal labor system under the industrial enterprise, where the labor was not beggar but has been a permanent labor and forced labor. The coal mining in Raniganj and Jharia, meaning thereby in eastern India, Bengal, Bihar, Jharkhand, or Odisha or MP, they have resulted into first the denudation of the forest. The forest was cleared, the forests were exploited, and there has been massive deforestation. Then only it was possible to have the mining. So, the mining should not be taken in isolation simply because it not only acquired land, it also acquired forest land to start mining and the mining field. The mining laws, mining rules 1899, 1903, mines have standardized licenses and royalties. It was a kind of a privatization. Private mines were introduced through standard licenses and royalties. And it has favored the European enterprises, European investors, the British investors who invested into Bengal coal companies. The Mines Act introduced certain safety rules and child labor restrictions, whereas the Mines Act 1923 regulated hours and safety measures. In independent India, the Coal Bearing Areas Act 1957 continued the same colonial policy of the mines and minerals and extraction of the coal, and it regulated further by a law known as Coal Bearing Areas Act of 1957. Although the British have been very careful and cautious to the mine safety, child labor, regulation of hours, a limited sense of welfare mechanism, but these laws virtually clamped land, forest, and agriculture land into vast minefield and the coal mining. It also created a lot of air pollution across the areas and resulted into degradation of land and the health of the people. The independent India's Mines Act, Mines and Mineral Regulation Act is to be seen into the colonial hangovers, whereby more it is of a revenue and less of the safety and environmental conservation. The other aspect into the environmental policy and historical perspective in India is the area of petroleum and natural gas. We can see that these two regulations were passed in the British India. The one is the Petroleum Act, which governed import, refining, and the transport of the oil. The Oil Field Regulation Act 1948 centralized licensing of the petroleum resources. In independent India, Oil and Natural Gas Commission was established in 1956 to ensure some energy independence and on a public sector model of being self-reliant and self-sufficient in oil production. Nonetheless, the prime goals of extraction of the petroleum resources and the oil field regulations continued in Petroleum and Mineral Pipeline Act 1962, which used very massive manner the Land Acquisition Act 1894 passed by the British India. Therefore, what we see that petroleum and natural gas management as one of the key areas of the offshore drilling and the sea resources and marine resources having its impact on the environmental degradation started in the British India, continued in the independent India with slight modification and changes. Then we see the fisheries and aquatic regulations. In this context, the Britisher in Bengal saw that they're fond of, in the coastal India, people have their staple diet of the fish. Therefore, the coastal India, especially in Bengal, they were very fond of fish as a staple diet, and there has been a very growing demand for it. Therefore, the people's involvement in the fishing and fishing rights as a customary right to have their own appetite and food and nutritional requirement was in practice. Moreover, the fisheries has been a kind of a pastime and a profession for the fishermen and the fisher folks to make their livelihood. This aspect of the fishing was also touched upon by Britishers by the environmental policies and laws in colonial India. They passed Indian Fisheries Act, which aimed to curb overfishing and marine pollution. But it tried to regulate more of a state control over the fishes. It tried to give license, it tried to give lease, tried to recognize some royalties. So the license, lease, royalties system were introduced to fulfill the commercialization of aquatic resources in India. So the law or Indian Fisheries Act become an important instrument in having a state control over the people's fishing rights and their entitlement which they had enjoyed without any kind of a inclusion in any kind of a document that they have a right. They enjoyed this right, have been set at margin. The Bengal Fisheries, Private Fisheries Act 1889 started granting the zamindari rights to fishery owners, and then these zamindari rights started commercializing the fisheries through royalty systems. Then, out of these two laws and policies of the Britishers in the arena of the fisheries, resulted into the community fishing rights replaced by the lease-based fisheries rights, and it created a kind of a private control of the fisheries. The fisheries on the aquatic resources and the sea resources and the coastal resources is the one. On the other hand, the inland fisheries like the rivers and ponds were also been brought to some leasing right and some licensing right. That's what we see, that the one it prioritized revenue, it tries to perceive fisheries and aquatic resources in India more as a sector of the economy and revenue generation than that of maintaining hydro sustainability or the hydro resources or the marine resources and the marine resource and their sustainability. After independence, the fishery policies also started in the same way, emphasizing on the production target and overexploitation, having a very marginal concern for ecological decline, and which is a major challenge even in the independent India as a natural sequel of the colonial fishery policies and aquatic resource policies. Then we also see that the community management and the indigenous system, which India Indians enjoyed right from the beginning, have been either monopolized, either commercialized, either controlled, and then it created a kind of a bureaucracy. So, right from the forest, right from the forestry, right from the land, the peasantry, the mineral, the mines, the petroleum resources, the water resources, the canal, irrigation, grazing field, they were all being acquired in a sledgehammer manner by the Land Acquisition Act, and to meet the needs of colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism, they severely compromise with traditional system, indigenous ecological practices, promoted bureaucratic control, and then it tries to create a kind of a colonial legal structure which continued even in the independent India, and most of the environmental enactment which are piecemeal, which are sporadic, which are peripheral, like Odisha River Board Act, like Fisheries Act, like Fishery Act, Private Fisheries, Bengal Private Fisheries Act. So most of the law have a local, regional, and national perspective depending upon the suitability of the commercialization and the revenue generation and extraction of the resources. Then it all led to rise of a kind of a legal framework whose roots and tentacles happens to be so strong in Indian environmental laws and policy that even today, after more than a quarter century of the independence, most of the environmental laws is still considered to be ingrained and imbibed and coated with some kind of a colonial hangovers, and the colonial policy having a centralized forest bureaucracy, having the state control, and having not much or not very serious concern about sustainability and equity. Therefore, these two lectures dealing on environmental policy in historical perspective, taking the case studies of forestry, water resources, petroleum resources, natural gas, mines and minerals, fish and fisheries. Under these 6 headings, we try to buttress the point that how the colonization of these environmental resources under their policies, laws, regulation, and statute have shaped India's environmental legal history, and how it have sidelined the issues of social justice, environmental justice, traditional environmentalism, and the traditional wisdom of the Indian people to nurture the environment and to promote sustainability and equity. Thus, any exercise of Indian environmental law remains within the purview of the colonial legacy, and it requires an immediate liberation so that the Indian environmental law should be more Indianized and have more indigenous content and have more indigenous input, taking it to stewardship of the betterment of the common man, and as well as protection, preservation of environment and the natural resources in India. With this, my dear learner, I hope that the environmental policy in historical perspective, 2 lectures will create a kind of a ground and a plateau from where we can, in a better manner, appreciate the onset of the Indian environmental law in promotion of sustainable development and ecological balance. With this, I thank and I wish you a happy learning.